All right, can you guys hear me in the back? All right? That sounds good. All right, I promised Christy I would make a short announcement before I start, and this will make all of you happy. The cafe is open for you to consume food. From what hours? Until 3:30, beginning at when this is done. Oh, they're open now, but please stay here for my presentation. So I'd like to begin just by reiterating the gratitude that my peers have expressed thus far in all of the support that our institutions have provided in the Ohio State for hosting this event, and then of course all the effort that you guys are putting into this, both the workshop leaders and the students. I think this all started about 8 months ago when Adam called me and he said, hey, I got this idea. I probably should, that's when I should have hung up, but I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't. It's been really incredible. So again, thanks to everybody who's been a part of it. I'd like to begin by formally introducing all of my guests. They're sitting here and they'll join me up here after I make my presentation. Andrew Atwood teaches at Southern California Institute of Architecture, and in 2001 he co-founded First Office, a design studio based in downtown Los Angeles. His forthcoming publications include essays in ThinkSpace Cityscapes pamphlet, Perspecta, and the inaugural issue of the Journal Project. Andrew lectured at SCI-Arc, Rice, UCLA, Cornell, USC, UVA. Do I have to read all of these? He recently led an ACSA panel on the agency of drawing and the digital process at MIT. His installations include 5 Doric columns at the Pacific Design Center, cone ceiling at the Beijing Biennale, and the forthcoming installation and pedestals at SCI-Arc Gallery. He has worked and consulted for Belzberg Architects, Moss, and Big. Andrew holds a BA in Political Science from the University of Richmond and a Master of Architecture degrees from Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Andrew's workshop this weekend employs visual development software to enliven static geometries through projection and precise overlay. The students have been using Touch Designer, a software platform that enables a real-time synthesis of geometry, animation, and projection. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Simon Kim and Mariana Ibanez. They're stranded due to the weather. Are they in New York still? They're still in New York, so Andrew's been kind enough to fill in for them. But I'd like to introduce them to allow them to be put in context, as I will still present their work. Mariana Ibanez is principal of IK Studio and associate professor of architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Prior to co-founding IK Studio, she worked at the Advanced Geometry Unit at Arab London before shifting to the office of Zaha Hadid. Mariana graduated from the University of Buenos Aires before attending the AA in London for her Master of Architecture degree, where she created responsive architectural prototypes through the implementation of adaptive structures. Her investigations in physical computing and augmented architecture continue in her practice and her academic research. Simon Kim is a licensed architect, principal of IK Studio, and assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design, where he directs the Immersive Kinematics Group. After graduating from the Design Research Laboratory at the AA in London, he was a designer and project architect for the office of Zaha Hadid and Gary Technologies. Simon's recent research has been an engagement with electronic devices, dynamic environments, and urban space as a continually mediated and perceptual frame. His postgraduate work at MIT was on cybernetics, machine architecture, and their translated design agencies. Mariana and Simon's workshop, in conjunction with Andrew, titled Dynamic Shells, has been focused on developing adaptive, thin shell canopy structures with the assistance of interactive design technology. So I'd also like to introduce Andrew then. I made him send me a bio this morning. Andrew Gardner received his BA in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania and is now a second-year graduate student in architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. He has worked with IK Studio for the last year and a half and has worked on several projects as well as assisted Simon in teaching seminars around the idea of mechatronics. I think that word probably scares the figural projections people, mechatronics, in architecture at Penn Design. While he has helped design 1 or 2 projects on IK Studio in a more traditional sense, his focus has really been on designing and developing and integrating various interactive elements within those projects. And then my third guest, Jason Kelly-Johnson, is a founding design partner of Future Cities Lab, an experimental design and research office based in San Francisco. Since 2002, Future Cities Lab has created a range of award-winning projects exploring the intersection of design with advanced fabrication technologies, robotics, responsive building systems, and public space. Jason was born and raised in Canada and received his Master of Architecture degree from Princeton University. His work has been published and exhibited worldwide, most recently at SF MoMA and the 01 Art and Technology Biennale. He was awarded the 2011 Architecture League of New York Young Architects Prize, the 2008-2009 Oberdick Fellowship at the University of Michigan, and the 2009 New York Prize Fellowship at the Van Allen Institute. In 2009, Jason began his collaboration with Andy Payne on Firefly for Grasshopper toolbar. Jason is currently an assistant professor at CCA in San Francisco. Jason's workshop this weekend, titled The Metabot Zoo, in his words, seeks to produce a radical menagerie of small, breathing, pulsating, and twitching robotic drawing machines. The students have been working to generate a new species of metabotic creatures that will exist simultaneously in physical and virtual worlds. So what I'd like to do now is frame the content of the group a bit more specifically. And I think one of the things that the four chairs were talking about yesterday was the differences that have started to develop, but also some of the commonalities between the two. I think one of the things that exists here today, in contrast to the two yesterday, for example, is the use of history as precedent. So whereas we understand the figural projections group to actually rely heavily on historical precedent and transformation of that precedent through deep analysis, this group, I think, is more about projecting forward with speculations on the implementation of technology within architectural design, both in the process and as a product, and that's something I'd like to expand on a little bit. And then similarly, I think the newness of this medium within architectural design also presents a larger array of projects and a diversity, even within each individual practice, in a very different way than the tactile objects group came together. And I think there was a lot of kind of very specific issues integrated into that group. Whereas here, I think it's been a challenge for me to also like synthesize the topics on the table and really think about how to bring these groups together. Active Models connects a group of designers that employ robotics and interactive technologies to link digital and physical environments. Their work utilizes embedded computation, continuous measurement, and kinetics to promote new modes of visual, spatial, and formal engagement. The workshop group identifies the significance of potential applications of robotics and interactive technologies within the architectural design process and understands the performative possibilities associated with kinetic, responsive, and interactive architectures. The ambition to gather these architectural designers and to discuss the possibilities for robotics and interactive technology within design evolves from a personal search for new forms of architectural production and engagement that embrace technologies that until recently have remained outside of the discipline of architecture. The group assembled today primarily uses the medium of the active model as a tool to develop larger concepts rather than becoming the architectural project or product in and of itself. From translation of conventional mediums for architectural production to translation of human behaviors in social scenarios, the discursive work of this group productively advances the role of technology and how it functions within architectural design. As opposed to the three other mediums being featured in this conference, as I said, precedent for this medium can only be primarily found in the recent past, but in a variety of forms. As a medium, active models can imply many things: interactive art objects, active fabrication techniques, robotic fabrication, responsive environments, and even buildings as robots. All of these instances rely heavily on technology as either a device that augments the production of something architectural or a device that becomes integrated into architecture quite seamlessly. So what I would like to do then is expand a little bit on how I have identified the active model to be a kind of critical player, again, in process and as product. Within the design process, the appropriation and application of robots and interactive technologies affords designers opportunities to translate their ideas and data between multiple mediums, such as drawings, models, and objects that are both virtual and tangible. As we all know, the hanging chain models from Gaudí were made of weights on strings that would serve as an inverted version of the arched forms he sought to physically construct. He traced the outline of the church he was designing on a wooden board at 1:10 scale. He then placed that on a ceiling of the small house next to the work site. He hung cords from the points where columns were to be placed. Next, he hung small sacks filled with pellets from column point to column point, simulating each catenary arch to form the cords. This active model actively negotiates gravitational forces to inversely simulate structural behavior in finding static equilibrium. The process is guided by incremental optimization and is controlled quite precisely to predict behaviors. An example from SCI-Arc. SCI-Arc is a performance artist who has visually probed and acoustically amplified his own body. One project, The Third Hand, has come to stand for a body of work that explored intimate interface of technology and prosthetic augmentation, not as a replacement, but rather in addition to the body. A prosthetic not as a sign of lack, but rather a symptom of excess. The Third Hand performances with amplified body signals and sounds have contributed to cyborg discourses on the body. In this instance, the Third Hand as an active model serves to augment, duplicate, and transform the functions of the hand. Outside of the potentials of these technologies to contribute to the design process are the opportunities that these technologies offer as products for performative architectures. Mechanically kinetic structures, active shading devices and responsive facade systems, and biologically inspired passive mechanical systems, to name a few. An early example of the active model as a product that continues to provide inspiration for those interested in engaging kinetic environments is the Fun Palace from Cedric Price in 1961. The Fun Palace proposed a time-based urban intervention comprised of a steel infrastructure for a kit of prefabricated walls, floors, and ceiling components. To be assembled, moved, and rearranged continuously relative to the shifting desires for the usage of the space. The active model here is a customizable infrastructure to engage in a diverse range of activities rather than prescription. A more recent reference, the room vehicle prototype, a robotic kinetic structure proposed by Greg Lynn, translates and adopts the concepts of animate form. Room vehicle prototype presents a motorized compact living cocoon that rotates to provide space for relaxing, sleeping, and bathing. 0 degrees is living, 90 degrees is kitchen and bath, and 180 degrees is sleeping and relaxation. In this instance, the active model acts as a product to accommodate known functions and activities in daily life. The topics of kinetics, responsivity, interactivity, and digital translations unite these designers in the search for new and novel manifestations of architectural intellection and productive provocation relevant to contemporary architectural investigations. These topics exist within a broader theme of digital and physical interchanges. The medium of the active model, consequently, finds relevancy in a variety of ways within the diverse methods by which robotics and interactive technologies are employed and applied within these 3 design research practices. Ultimately, this group seeks to organize projects and discussions surrounding this topic in an effort to promote productive and provocative applications of these technologies for architectural design. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more directly to the work of my guests and attempt to tie back their work as it relates to how I understand these models to work in process or as product. In multiple research projects that Andrew Atwood has initiated, self-made robots are used to translate drawings into objects. Andrew identifies drawing as the primary medium for architectural production and embraces the gap that emerges during the process of physical, three-dimensional translation. Machine 1 translates line drawings into what he calls furry guys. The furry guys are a direct result of the loose interpretation and translation of precise digital line work. The objects find life somewhere in between the mess and the organization, to quote him. Between the mess and the organization of the point of conception and the methodology of transformation. Allowing the imprecise translation of the two-dimensional drawing to yield irregular material formations and preferring fidelity to control, Andrew creates physical objects that materialize and enliven an otherwise immaterial and subdued medium. The objects that he creates, exploiting the inaccuracies of the digital translation, exhibit looseness in comparison to the control of the digital drawing. These objects take on personalities and become characters. In the case of this looseness, the injection of the robot as the medium of physical production affords Andrew the opportunity to intellectualize the fidelity of digital to physical translation. In Plastic String Things, Andrew investigates the generative capacity of the robot as a translation device that breathes new life into the architectural construct via looseness as a method of development. Whereas others in his generation may be concerned with the emotional and affective qualities that these tangible objects exhibit, Andrew is instead infatuated with the tension that exists in the discrepancies between drawing and object, enabled only by the activation of the robot as a tool for architectural production. More recently, Andrew continues to explore the distance between drawing and construction via translation and projection. In his columns projects, the CNC wire cutter provides a new relationship between drawing and machine, as the wire acts as both a line of construction and projection. The machine produces an object in between drawing and object, and the column continues to serve as a source of inspiration relative to digital translations and transformations. Jason Kelly Johnson of Future Cities Lab embraces interactive technology in order to create a series of what his office terms live models. Future Cities Lab defines live models as dynamic formations that measure, register change, and adapt. These models and the interactive technologies that they employ collect, translate, and enliven data. His Aurora project presents an index of shifting territorial resources in the Arctic. In the original investigations of this project, the live model serves as a mapping device put in place to capture this transformation. The main interactive piece, the Aurora model, superimposed the ephemeral qualities of these representations with the dynamic behavior of multiple users, translating the shifting dimensions of ice into a responsive light field. Depending on the scale of the application and the point at which interactive technology is injected into the design process, these live models take on a variety of responsibilities. Live models can be used as analytical engines or as conceptual frameworks for architecture. They can calculate underlying logics and identify emerging organizations. They can yield dynamic and spatial cartographies of user-generated data. Transcending the conventional application of model as representational tools, live models can also become interactive, habitable, sensorial spaces in and of themselves. And I'd like to show a couple of additional projects that kind of work across that spectrum and that range. The Glaciarium project exists as an art object. The piece is an interactive instrument that engages a smaller group of user senses through the sight and sound of the melting ice core and accelerated through incremental heating. The Theater of Lost Species presents the live model as a simultaneous engaging object, static exhibition, and interactive installation. Screens mounted at the end of the openings will display a curated virtual ecology of lost marine species. Sensors will allow these digital creatures to react to visitors, while slowly pulsating light nozzles create a playful atmosphere. The Data Grove project is a commissioned project installed in November in San Jose. The piece thrives on information from its urban environment. In collecting live Twitter feeds that are read back through the electronic infrastructure, it renders invisible data and atmospheric phenomena into variable intensities of light and sound. It provides shelter and a place of calm to contemplate data streams from sources near and far. The grove's luminescent fibers gently sway with the breeze and respond to the proximity of visitors with quiet, whispering sonic undulations. The live model as a new representational tool differs from its purpose to speculate and provoke in a project such as Hydromax. Here, the implementation of the live model as a speculative active spatial scenario captures latent energies and calls into question normative contemporary urban conditions. Collectively, the projects produced by Future Cities Lab enlist interactive technology to produce architectural objects and spaces that are both performative and engaging. The range of projects showcase the methods by which interactive technology is incorporated in a very diverse way, allowing the active models to exist both in process and as product. And although they're not here, like I said, I'll still present the work of Mariana and Simon, and then Andrew will be responsible for fielding questions on behalf of them, if there are any. Mariana Ibanez and Simon Kim present optimistic and engaging scenarios for the synthesis of architecture, design, interactive technology, and engineering. They refuse to accept that architecture must be static or inert, and instead propose kinetic surfaces, objects, and structures that change the way that humans interact with the built environment. Their research on the application of interactive technology expands the roles of architecture and engineering, focusing on integrating robotics and embedded intelligence into buildings, cities, and cultures. Their work takes the forms of dancing robots, immaterial clothing, intelligent wall systems, and folding architecture, and speculates on the presence of digital technology and interactive objects as occupants and at times active participants of our personal and shared physical spaces. Redesigning interior and exterior partitions became the domain of the Sensor Wall research prototype. In this project, IK Studio considered walls to be more than a static geometry and investigated the potential for walls to construct new relationships between subjects and objects through physical transformation. The basic prototypical module is a framework holding an array of pins held by springs with a thin membrane stretched among them. And as each pin is pulled and pushed on one side, the member is deformed to show the imprint on the other side. As a wall component, this allows for partitioning of space that is negotiable and shared. The Cloud Cloak project fuses fashion and architecture. In their words, the Cloud Cloak is a device that emits a wearable cloud. It emits a cover that negates the objectifying gaze of the observer. The device also allows the subject to choose a moment of respite and willful separation from the city as the cloud creates a singular space of occupancy. In a project such as Science Performs, IK Studio speculates on the possibility of a robot to become an active participant in the built environment. Working with the idea of dancer-machine interaction, the team produced a range of subject-object propositions on the edge and overlaps of human and machine in device. For IK Studio, it was an opportunity to speculate on architecture and space for new forms of digital and physical occupation. The body of work from IK Studio proposes that the active model transcend the conventional relationships between man and machine and engage with humans in a truly interactive way. So as I mentioned earlier, in many of the projects that my invited guests produce, the medium of the active model serves as a tool to develop larger concepts rather than becoming the architectural project or product in and of itself. Because of the ongoing research and architectural output of these individuals, I'm very excited and optimistic about the possibilities of future integration between technology and architecture. And I think it's something, as I mentioned earlier, that's really just beginning, and there's not a lot of historical reference or even recent historical reference. And so I think it's exciting, especially for them, to be able to kind of lead the charge and take responsibility for pushing this forward in terms of integration in the most responsible way. I hope that's okay. So I think what I would like to do, I would like you guys to come up here, if that's okay. And I think I would like to start, you know where your name tag is? That would be strange if you sat in the wrong one. I won't put Andrew G. on the spot today, as I promised I wouldn't, because he accepted the invitation to join us. But I would like to ask Andrew and Jason questions directly to them. And then I would like to ask one other question that any of them can respond to, and that will hopefully provide some fuel for discussion. And I think it would be most fantastic if we can get some questions from the other workshop leaders and even the students, or any of the other invited guests. So I'll first ask my question to Jason. One of the things that, I guess I should also say that I didn't know any of these guys personally beforehand, and so it's been really exciting for me to research their work. And I think I also have a bit of a challenge in that I didn't have personal connections with them, so in a way I'm guessing at a lot of things, and I hope I made educated guesses. So for Jason's work, one of the things that comes up time and time again is oftentimes a celebration of the technology and the ways in which it's integrated into the work, which I think is quite different from Andrew's, and even a little bit different from the way that IK Studio thinks about the intersection of technology and architecture, and also the role that it has in aesthetics. And I guess the question that I have for you is in the overall visual presentation and the way that the aesthetics are developed within your project. I mean, how do you think about celebrating that or integrating it to at times really call attention to it as an integral player, or at times mask it to celebrate other things?
Sure. I'm going to turn these guys on. Is it on? Yeah, I would say it's on. You know, the question's relative to how do we begin to fold technology in our sort of pursuit of interactive technologies into the sort of aesthetic agenda. And I would say that, a lot of the projects, will start a lot like I'm getting my students to start today, right? It actually starts with a kind of an initial idea about how to kind of, develop a kind of a technology. And then we actually try and find a way for that technology to begin to express itself, having an aesthetic agenda in and of itself. So, like the Data Grove project, for instance, it really literally started with understanding, I guess the project as an example, right, started with me realizing that when I was posting to my Twitter account, I was actually posting, I was actually able to locate everywhere that tweet was posted from. So if you're tweeting, it's geolocated, which means you can get on a map and actually figure out exactly where the tweet was posted. So that actually started as, that was the beginning of that project. So how do you actually develop an aesthetic with that idea? And a part of that was thinking in my head, well, why do we, the Twitter sphere, why is it only on a kind of a cell phone or on a website? Why couldn't we have a kind of place in the city to begin to express this kind of hidden data stream? So the project actually started just by looking at this thing that is sort of out there. There are millions of tweets, literally every day, especially in the Bay Area. I was looking at how they were sort of situated, and was just sort of thinking, how could we make a space? I'm not even sure it was an aesthetic notion in the beginning. It was more like, how do we begin to kind of spatialize this data? And so a lot of our project will start that way. They'll start with a much broader idea. It's not necessarily an idea about history per se. It's an idea about kind of technology. So that the notion with the DataGo project was really to kind of take that and make a kind of almost a contemporary. We thought of it as a kind of a whispering wall. Like, how do we make an expressive space that literally became a kind of outlet for invisible data streams? And that's really the way that project began to evolve. And in terms of the aesthetic agenda, I mean, I think we were constantly talking about this idea that the data would begin to envelope you and wrap you and kind of twist you, and I think we just started to play with fiber optics, and so the aesthetic really just sort of starts off as a kind of an idea about kind of thinking about materially how it would kind of operate. So yeah, I would say it's very different than I would say the first two panels in a way. Like, I think we'll start tinkering, and we'll start kind of playing with models and just sort of let it kind of manifest itself maybe in a much more, I would say, informal process. And that's why I would say the work in our studio doesn't have a singular say aesthetic to it.
Right.
We don't actually necessarily try and make a kind of continuum between projects, because everything that we're doing is in a way totally unique. We're very, I would say, almost promiscuous in that sense. So that project is a good example.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's also an issue of scale too. Like we discussed yesterday, I think it was Andrew Holder that mentioned at a certain scale, the amount of detail that you can always be able to focus on, like 100% everywhere, gets lost a little bit. And I think that's why in a project like Hydromax, it actually takes on a different life relative to the other projects, because it can't really, even if it didn't want to, fetishize like the technology at all. I mean, it becomes about something much larger, and it's really about what that technology enables, rather than really putting it on the forefront.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the Hydromax, so if you guys don't know, the Hydromax project was a proposal that we did, a commission for SF MoMA to do a kind of responsive, massive urban scale responsive kind of proposal. And we, for the show, we basically made an 8-foot long kind of responsive robot that had a series of proximity sensors, you can see here. And the idea was to make a model that would be constantly evolving in the gallery. So every time you went to the gallery, the piece would actually be evolving and kind of changing in real time. And so in a way, we were looking at just the idea of kind of proximity and the idea of kind of interaction and kind of participation as a kind of active. Am I allowed to say active agent, Thomas? Or active as a kind of active, kind of corrupting agent. And I think we do that in a lot of these things. This idea of embedding a kind of live medium, whether it's Twitter or it's a core of ice, right? Trying to find something that has a degree of kind of asymmetry to it, or a degree of kind of sort of randomness, something that we can't control, and embed that deep in the project and allow the project in a way to evolve from that kind of embedded logic. Yeah. And so whether it's people moving around a model or people moving within it, there's always that kind of idea.
Right. Yeah, I mean, actually I think that provides a nice transition into what I'd like to talk to Andrew about, or ask you about, where I think the use of what we're calling the active model is much more integral to the process, clearly, than it is in terms of serving the product, or even becoming part of the product. The question I have for you then is really dealing with the kind of relationship between process and product. When you lectured at SCI-Arc, you talked about the way in which you're very much invested in finding that creative space between the mess and the organization, and really expertly developing those techniques in terms of the looseness, which seems kind of counterintuitive, I think. But to me, it's a really exciting use of the model to breathe new life into something rather than to provide a literal translation through more conventional means of robotic fabrication. And so I guess the question really comes down to, you know, asking how much responsibility do you feel over like producing a controlled output, rather than, I think as you prefer, letting kind of chance take over in terms of allowing the robot to misinterpret or reinterpret a drawing. And so the question really is, how do you understand and develop the relationship in your work between process and product?
It's a hard question.
Just to flip the switch.
There we go. It's a difficult question for me to answer. I think only because for me there's I would say even right now, a real shift in the way that I'm thinking about like the role of process in the stuff that I do. A couple years ago, I would have said that I was only concerned with the process. I wasn't interested in questions of scale, experience, really any of those things. I mean, the machines and the stuff that you showed is work that I did a couple of years ago now, and so I'm very much in a different place. But if I can, to return to that stuff, I mean, for me, it was simply the identification of something that I felt was central to architecture, a kind of problem that had a history, that had references, that had things that I could work on and attempt to destabilize, to shift what I would view as sort of shared practices, things that we might all collectively be able to talk about. So at the time, I didn't know any other way to do that other than sort of attack the drawing. And figure out really, really literal ways of doing that. So directly translating machine, like curves or lines drawn in a computer or even by hand, and having them manifest themselves directly through a machine, and then finding the places where understanding the drawing is a kind of device for translating or transmitting information, and then intentionally or discovering where that's the sort of where that information gets lost or what happens in that process, and then just perverting basically those gaps. And so I actually had no interest in the end, it's funny, the furry guys thing is, and I said this yesterday, probably everybody should Google themselves. I think everyone does. That thing is like my head. I mean, it's the first like
you are a furry guy.
Yeah. And I have no interest in that thing as a kind of
artifact. Right?
Yeah, it's simply a kind of thing to display all of the stuff that led up to it, and all of the different ways that the sort of gaps and the looseness of the way that the things translate, and exposes what I think for me is a sort of false. Basically, everything is low fidelity. There is no hi-fi project. I mean, every material, like everything, doesn't translate directly, even like ideas about real time, or for me, sort of false concepts, because there's always going to be a gap, and trying to find sort of where those things become interesting conceptually was what I was doing in this project. So the important thing about I guess if I could be critical about the Furry Guy project, is that there was no reference, really. I didn't know what I was sort of shifting, which is the reason why I've become obsessed with columns, because there's so much baggage with them that everybody recognizes how you're screwing them up. And so, like, working with and looking at old drawings and the ways that people represented, constructed, materialized those things, and how you can begin to kind of disturb that with, let's say, contemporary sensibilities or technology. So and then for me, that then gets to the question that we talked a little bit about last night, which is like, does that mean you have to, like when Claude Perrault puts a grid behind his orders, that's a fundamental, for me, that's a kind of, and I'm not a historian, but I look at that and it's a kind of fundamental transformation in the way that one might draw a very conventional thing, the way that it's given order, and that's what I'm trying to do, I think, in all of the work, which is take things that everyone understands and kind of screw them up,
Right.
so that we can all understand that they're screwed up, and then develop new techniques or try to challenge the sort of conventions with which we might represent them. Sorry to rant.
No, that's good. I'll hold off on the other question that I was going to ask to the entire panel and ask if there's any questions from the audience. And if there's not,
People are uncomfortable asking questions about like robots, I think.
Were you about to raise your hand, Doug?
Yeah. I've heard an argument that if you design something to like evolve or to eventually design itself, that it's kind of like a lazy technique. I've been called lazy basically, like an iterative technique. I just wanted to hear your all's thoughts on kind of setting it up and then letting it go.
So just so everybody hears what Doug asked, he is asking about the sense that there may be perceived laziness in generative design in terms of giving over control to a kind of systematic development that's maybe enabled by computation.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, this is a comment that in many ways, I've said to some of my students before. I said, this script or whatever, this grasshopper definition is not going to solve the problems. You're going to have to make some decisions, right? I'm assuming that's probably where this is coming from. Like, it's much more in the sense that, you can inherit some kind of algorithm, and then it's gonna make all the decisions for you. I mean, I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to tighten that, right? We're trying to allow some of those variables to be explicit and allow them. I like your sort of description of this kind of corrupt process where there's a kind of make it more legible, the imprecision between what the computer really wants and what a fabrication machine will give you or a robot will actually do. Allow there to be sort of other elements in there to begin to kind of corrupt the process. I wouldn't call that lazy. Actually, it takes like 35 times more time to actually embed those things. But I would say that what we're trying to do, and I'm not sure we've done it well yet, but we're trying to find that kind of gap and embed those elements in it. And it doesn't solve the issue. It becomes a kind of, in the language of some of the other panels yesterday, it becomes a kind of, you almost have to have a compositional strategy. It's just a different kind of strategy. It's like on a slider, right? And you have to understand what the variables are that you want. You don't freeze the design process and say this is perfect, right? You're trying to find a kind of a range of perfection or a range of aesthetic moments that you want the piece to explore. So you don't want it to be a 0 and you don't want it to be 100, but you know that you want it to kind of pan back and forth between those things, right? And you want it to begin to kind of evolve. That's kind of the way that we're approaching stuff. We're looking at, we'll actually push things here, we'll push things here, and we'll find that sweet spot. But it's never an absolute moment. It actually has a kind of a range to it. And so I don't think that there's a laziness to that. I think it's a very different, I would say, strategy to the way that we're thinking about space and the way we're considering time. And also in our work, the way that we're trying to embed logics that are, say, outside of the traditional toolkit of architecture and try and embed them in the project. So, Kyle mentioned SCI-Arc as an example, and other kind of artists that are dealing with media and dealing with participatory kind of art forms, and trying to look at how those could begin to be folded into the kind of the logic of architecture. And that's really what we're trying to do. Is it lazy? I don't know.
I actually, when you say that using Grasshopper or whatever generative tool is a solution, we take a completely different approach because we don't really believe in like a top-down approach where the tool is aiding or augmenting the human that's creating it or controlling it. We're trying to create a symbiotic, almost subject-subject relationship where cybernetics or robotics are subject and really respond reactively and interactively with the individual. And so to whoever that tells you that it's lazy, it's about creating a responsive environment where it's not trying to solve a problem for you at all. that's not what we are investigating in any way.
To defend the lazy, maybe. There's almost nothing about this, the scripts or the things that I write that probably is anywhere close to the sophistication that some of these guys work with. For me, but to sort of condemn it as lazy is to have a very narrow view of the way that one might work in any creative field. And so for me, what I do, my interest in those things is to write stuff that just can produce a lot of stuff and work serially, or develop knowledge through that as opposed to refining, right? Like for me, the ability to sort of produce vast differences by pressing a button and producing like 1,000 things, and then learning to develop a sensibility or a knowledge about those things just by looking at a lot of them and a lot of them quickly is what to me is exciting about the kind of laziness, at least in my own work. You know, I mean, I haven't written a piece of code or any script or developed a grasshopper definition that was anything more than like 3 or 4 steps. Well, one, because I'm lazy, and also I'm impatient, and I want to like shit it out, you know. So for me, I guess that sort of, it's just such a narrow way to attack, or just such a narrow way to think about how one might design something, I guess.
I've got a question. And I promise I'm not being a vindictive crank, but I actually want to kind of re-raise the issue of representation that was kind of launched yesterday afternoon. So just to, but I want to do it in
Andrew, I know I'm going to, I was telling everyone last night I'm going to lose this argument.
and speculative and productive way. So if the question was more or less the kind of prove it and have the grounds for proof be a drawing of some kind or a representation of some kind, I find that this work has beautiful bodies of representation for the inputs that are mostly in the realm of data visualization, beautiful representations for the outputs, but I find that the representations avoid the issue of the robot as an actor in the world. Like, where is the characterization or the representation of the robot, how it behaves, what it does, and its kind of posture with respect to the universe? And is that a kind of drawing type that you are even interested in?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. One of the things that we just recently, in the past couple of years, have been really looking deeply at is this idea of machine vision. And so how do these robots actually begin to map out and in a way understand their environment? So when you look at, Stanford developed, several universities did these kind of DARPA grant-funded cars, and they were fascinating, right? And what I really learned from studying with some folks that were working on those things is this idea of kind of redundant vision. So those robots are actually seeing the world with lasers, right? So they're actually mapping. There's a laser that's actually rotating, on a plate, and it's mapping, and it's actually it knows exactly how far everything is from it. So that's one kind of sensor. Another one is a camera, right? That's panning around, that's doing things like edge detection, color detection, detecting all of these kind of anomalies. There's sound, there's all these kinds of redundant sensing. So the actual robot is actually seeing the environment and mapping the environment in real time. And it's overlapping all of those representations in real time. And I've been really fascinated by that because it actually clarified for me how I was seeing the world and how I was remaking the world. And so I'd love to share with you some of the representations, and a lot of actually what my students are doing right now in my workshop is they're actually making maps of the world through the lens of a sensor. And that becomes the representation, but it's different, right? Because the representation necessarily is having to update itself in real time. And there are ways, I think, to do that effectively, and I agree that I think that data needs to be shared and it needs to become a much more active part of the kind of the process. Because I think it would actually begin to kind of inform the kind of understanding of the work. But a lot of that is just kind of data streaming, right? It's just coming in and it's happening in real time. So I don't know.
Yeah, all the machines I built a few years ago are in a lot of ways copies of existing technology. I mean, that machine one is a MakerBot basically that I decided to draw, and by that I mean and what was interesting to me about that was that to draw a machine in the way that it is as an architect, or from the perspective of an architect, is a very different way than to do it from the perspective of an engineer. So for me, I don't know if this answers the question about how that, a representation of how that thing actually exists in space. I'm actually not interested in robotic buildings. I guess in my own work, I think that I'm sure that that's where we're going, so we're gonna be dealing with it. But just that for me, that the sort of question of representation is pervasive through all of the things. So this doesn't answer the question exactly, but that for me is when when I draw that machine, that MakerBot thing, I draw it as an architect would draw it, and then it sort of instantiates itself in our discipline simply because of the sort of conventions that are then applied to it. I don't know if that's the only way I can think of how it actually begins to sort of operate in a space, but it's not a kind of atmosphere. It's a disciplinary space, I guess. That doesn't answer the question at all, but that's how I think about the drawings of those things.
No, I'll have to agree. Like when we do construction drawings or shop drawings for any of our small models, or even for some of the larger installations that we've tried to build, I mean, it's a static object, doesn't even represent any of the interaction. If you go back to the sensor wall diagram, that's in drawing form usually the most we can do in terms of trying to explain that responsiveness. As of the last year, we've realized that video and cinema and just that whole medium has become incredibly integral into explaining, documenting. It's not just a representation of the final product. We take all sorts of cinema studies of the project as it develops, and it's become a design tool for the development of the projects at this point.
So this is kind of like an ongoing conversation that Thomas and I had, and when Jason was responding earlier about this kind of things that was reminded me. We've been talking a lot about the relationship between will and method. And so if we were to be, also if I were to compare this to music and instrument, right? I feel like yesterday the two panels we saw two genres of music. And when I say music, I mean content, right? And it's not to say that there is a, because the work is really beautiful, but then there is also maybe to address the idea of representation. There's something about the imageability of technology that becomes the forefront of what this sensation is. If I was to use the word sensation, like I think it becomes the visualization of the instrument somehow, maybe. But I'm also kind of like thinking about the relationship between whether this is becoming a really good instrument maker, or we get into speedify.
Is that a question?
Well, yeah, it's kind of maybe something to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'd like to expand on that as well, because I think to talk about the question of experience also goes back to Andrew's question a little bit about the robot as a player, potentially. And I think it's something that each of these three offices do very, very differently. And I think certainly some of those differences come out today. I think in the work of IK Studio that you really, I think in that sense it becomes the most truly engaging way that the instrument transcends itself as an instrument, because it starts to change the way that people behave. Like if you're dancing with a robot and you're forced to confront with it influencing itself, its actions back on you, it's a kind of cyclical thing. Whereas I think there's different. I think in Andrew's case, the instrument serves as a method or a means by which to produce productive estrangement in the case of the columns. Which I think also relates back to some of the things that you guys talked about in your panel discussion, which is loose associations for the sake of engagement, and having some sense of fundamental point of reference that you have an association with that is now transformed. So I think in that case the model or the technology or the instrument enables that rather than is that. And I think for Jason's work, it's for me it kind of oscillates somewhere in between, where depending on the scale of the implementation or the time at which it's introduced, it can enable something much greater than itself, or at times it really does celebrate itself as fantastic technology that can engage people in a pretty direct way, not through estrangement, but through kind of, I think at times novelty, but at other times just excitement, like producing something that people can react to without having knowledge of where it comes from or the kind of discipline-specific considerations related to those instruments.
Yeah, I think the instrument, it's funny that a lot of the work that I have been doing the last 10 years actually emerged out of a class that I was teaching, co-teaching with a musician, an electronic musician. And the class was called Robotic Ecologies, and it was co-taught with the music department. So I had 10 PhD music students building electronic instruments, and I had 10 architecture students working together to kind of collaborate. The musicians were building musical instruments, and the architecture students were building robotic devices. And there was this really fascinating kind of interplay between those two worlds, where one was, I would say, kind of performance-based. It was about sound and the kind of light and the effect of things. And then the architects had a kind of spatial and kind of material agenda, and really fascinated with them as kind of contraptions. And the collaboration between those two worlds, for me, really set off a kind of a body, an agenda of work that I've been kind of playing with for like 10 years. And one of the things that I realized in that process was, when I was younger, I don't know if I was well known, but I was known for making lots of models of the same thing with slight variations. So I would make 30 models, each one with a slight tweak, much like Angie's, the guy, you guys are making the totem foam pieces, lots of different ones with slight variations, right? And then when I started collaborating with the musicians, I actually, came up on the realization by making a 9 grid cube and making literally a cube that was made out of servo motors, that I could actually produce, 100 variations with a single, kinematic device. And I could script those, and I could actually send messages to it, and it would actually reform itself, and then reform itself here. And then attaching sensors to that allowed really these kind of little mechanisms, right, to then respond to kind of environmental effects. And so the idea of this kind of instrument, I think it's kind of dead on. But that, in a way, for me, allowed the work to kind of evolve to where it is now. Not ever trying to fix something and say that that's it. Actually fixing a range of things, fixing a range of kind of points in space, and then allowing them to evolve. Not always evolve to the point where they self-destruct, where they just sit as a cube, but finding that kind of in-between zone. And I think that's really, a part of what we're doing really explicitly now. And is it compositional? Is it aesthetic? I don't, I'm not positive yet, but I think it's got lots of potential.
I have a question that I think it runs the risk of being a little bit redundant because I think you guys have touched on some of this stuff, but I want to ask it in a more direct way, which is just a question about authorship, like how you define your authorship. Like the easiest way, I think especially for you, Jason, the way you were talking about the kind of toggle is to go to like Manuel Delanda's sort of redefinition of authorship in relation to computation. So it's more of setting a kind of animate process in motion and then being someone who kind of like manages it, but there's a new distance. It's not the kind of sketch on paper and the master author. I kind of want to move past that, and I think you guys do, both of you guys, but I want to hear maybe more explicitly you state a kind of definition or a working definition for your authorship in your processes.
Let me just also ask that. Adam's asking about the relationship of authorship within the design process of each of the individuals relative to computation.
Yeah, I would say that, it's really not something I think about too often. In our own work, I think it's pretty clear, that I don't think it changes really. I don't think it changes anything that radically. I think just because you're producing a range doesn't matter. I think it's much like, if you have a car, you have different things around us actually have that embedded in them. If you're a landscape architect, you have that, it's just a part of the kind of way of thinking. For me, it has resonance with other fields And they're not concerned with that as a kind of idea. If it's not fixed, if it's not, kind of set, every other field, many other fields that I can think of have that and then require that, right? Require participation, require change, allow some level of kind of adaptability. So I think for me that's kind of interesting. And I had a conversation recently about what something like Firefly would do for kind of an architectural drawing or the authorship of drawing. I mean, basically Firefly, for instance, allows an architectural drawing to be updated in real time, right? So you can actually do a traditional plan drawing of a space and attach it to Firefly and then watch how that begins to adapt. You could begin to think of an architectural model or drawing as being something that is active throughout the process of the life of a building, for instance. So not only is an architectural model or drawing, is it used for the production of something, it's actually used throughout its lifespan. So it's used to build the thing, it's used to analyze the thing, it's actually used to, in a post-occupancy way, it's used to understand energy cycles, occupation cycles, it's used to then loop back and provide feedback into the environment. So, I don't know, I think I don't know if that's about authorship, but it's about kind of control, and it's that the methods of architectural production, I think, are changing in a way. They're actually becoming much more alive, and maybe inputs into an architectural model or drawing might come from other fields. They might allow other fields to begin to kind of plug into them in a more active way.
And this may be the interactive designer in me. In my role within IT Studio, maybe I'm a hammer and everything appears as a nail, but a lot of our authorship comes from, I would say, the interaction and how people respond to the product and the creation. A project you didn't show, but I think can represent this somewhat, is a project called DC Loci that we did last year. It's a large urban, it started actually as a cinema study of how a person walks through the city of Washington, DC. And then it developed from there and started looking at the master planning of how DC developed, and then about looking at creating new loci within the city and kind of reimagining the city of DC completely differently. And we created a game board, actually. We created these little avatar models, referring to them as loci. And as people move these around, there's sensor, computer vision, and it interactively changed the city, rotated different neighborhoods, fractured neighborhoods, completely changed the whole governmental section of the city. And people could really interact with that, and it was about that interaction. It was really, I think, what was key to us, and in general with our projects.
It's one thing. I mean, maybe I'm reading too much, or been given too much literary theory from the late '60s right now. But I react so negatively to that word authorship. I think because of that. But just to sort of try to respond to the question, and for me, and this gets into the sort of realm of psychoanalyzing myself, but there's a sort of drive to remain productive, and I'm constantly looking for ways to sort of construct that space. And for me, it oftentimes has to do with directly copying or ripping off a kind of historical precedent as a means to then, and this, so we can talk about the anxiety of influence and all that other stuff. So I don't think of myself as creating something new or even claiming full authorship over something, but trying to sort of produce something that I recognize as part of a lineage, and then I can understand sort of the difference or the swerve or any of the terms that you want to talk about that allows me to kind of evaluate what for me is the successes or the failures of the project. So I don't think for me it's not about authorship, but it's just a kind of relentless drive to do something, and how do you do that? And that's how I respond to the question.
Can I actually respond to that and maybe also ask another question? Because my reading of your work, Andrew, is I think the gap, the low fidelity is incredible critical value to it in the sense that it evacuates meaning entirely from the process. So the kind of thing that's produced is not meant, I mean, it could be read in relationship perhaps to the initial sort of idea, but the process is actively engaged in evacuating any kind of consideration for what that thing is beyond the terms on which it was produced. And I think, like, responding to the representation issue as well, those kind of physical models, I would call those the drawings. I don't think you can draw anything else about the process. That it's so actively engaged in interrupting representation that to draw would be kind of, I think, working against the idea of what's in question. So I guess beyond that kind of comment, I think that the question of authorship, though, has to do with the way that you design the project. So what is the kind of the destination for the question? And I think that, like Andrew, in your case, and we've talked about this some, the question, the answers that are being produced are not necessarily inscribed in architectural practice in some way. And I guess I wonder, maybe for the pulpit, I'd say, I think that you can't maybe speak for in the same capacity, but the question is, like, how do you inscribe some of these techniques? I think very valid and interesting ways of rethinking design. How do you inscribe that within a kind of practice?
That's for you.
Sorry, it's a difficult question.
I guess that for me is an I don't know. Yeah, to be honest, I can't even give you an answer to the question right now. I mean, I don't even think I wouldn't even say that I'm even practicing in a way that operates from that. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm going to have to say the same thing. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting issue, I would say, with, doing similar work in a way, some of the machines that we're developing. It doesn't make sense to me to, like, draw the machine doing what it's doing, like, to just, it makes sense. It doesn't, somehow, like, my logic has shifted. Do I make a comic? Do I make a freeze frame animation of it? I mean, these kind of mediums just don't really resonate with us, nor does even taking a video is another thing. For me, the most active thing is actually watching the interface be updated in real time, and to interact with the interface. And then that's where, so it's basically the viewer is kind of implicated in a part of the kind of composition. It doesn't make sense to me just to freeze it and sort of show somebody what it kind of looks like. With a lot of our projects, it just makes much more sense to have something be updated in real time, have you be a kind of a co-participant or kind of co-creator of whatever it is. I don't know if that makes sense, David.
I think it's somewhat related to the question that was asked by Andrew yesterday to the tactile objects group in terms of, like, how do you draw it? What does the drawing do, and what's the value of the drawing in that process? And I think much the same can be said for how that group works. Like, you can't draw pulling and pushing wet plaster in a balloon. It wouldn't be worth it. The drawing would have to take on a different form as either like an analytical tool or, it wouldn't be worth it to kind of re-represent that.
I mean, okay, maybe now I understand the question. But I guess I would argue that to put pressure on that project, specifically the sort of plaster thing, is important only because I think it then opens up new possibilities in terms of the way one might draw something to represent those things. So for me, the foam things have to do with the way that, like, those are drawings or instantiations of variables that people oftentimes don't associate with drawings. Speed, heat, things like this are actually put into the object and are thought of as new variables for drawing, okay? Now, it probably completely fails at doing that, but it's an attempt to do that. And so for you to like put pressure on that project and then to begin to describe or show someone how or translate the sets of information that would be required rather than having to just sort of demonstrate it, for me that might open up a kind of new it would have to be a new type of representation, and that to me would be interesting. So how do you describe those things besides just saying you got to pull a little bit harder? I mean, I think it can be drawn actually in that case.
I mean, I guess the sense of rigor in terms of how do you prove rigor for, the stretching of rubber and plastic is how do you prove rigor in the creation of personalities or interaction of object, and I guess we face the same criticism, just to be critical of our own projects. I don't know if we have a particularly good way of explaining or showing that at this point. It's something we're trying to work on, I think.
Do you have a question? Was that a question? What? No. Do you have one? Okay, then we'll wrap up because we're over.
You brought up Greg Lynn.
Uh-huh.
I thought we talked a lot about seriality and newness, but it seems interesting to kind of contrast your work against, let's say, the evolution that seems to happen with Greg Lynn in terms of animated, you're not doing so much about this evolutionary processes about the product.
So it's not, it's shifted from a kind of an analysis of motion to trying to hatch, devices that were actually producing that motion.
Sure, I think it's relevant in terms
Yeah.
of the extent of possible mediums to really discuss that segue, right, into development.
I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with engagement too, like thinking about, and that's why I asked Andrew about process versus product, and really thinking about the productive nature of something that ultimately you have responsibility for and put out into the world. And so clearly there's a difference in the way that the early project of animate form existed and now in the way that things are actually animated, but it's for a totally different purpose in my mind, and maybe even not fair to combine the two.
Yeah, I think another thought, relative to this issue of representation that I see in Andrew's work and some of the stuff that we're doing is this sort of frustration, I would say, with the kind of traditional ways that architects represent things. It's been, pen and paper and May lines, then plotters, then all this kind of stuff, right? Which all of us, at least I'm of a generation that was trained, with a May line and a triangle, and that, started off that way, right? With these little simple machines and devices to represent things. And I see in your work, and one of the big reasons we decided to kind of spend all this time producing Firefly was just this frustration with what was out there. I can't stand, sending my students show up with these 3D printed models, and I'm just like, it's high fidelity, like it looks exactly like what's in the computer, and I'm like, well, why'd you do that? It doesn't. So so that's why I think we've shifted. I'm teaching a class right now on, building custom-made 3D printers, secretion robots, things that actually will allow architects to actually expand both, let's just say, how they represent things and actually let the machines actually participate. So if you're customizing your mode of representation, you're making drawing machines, you're making printing machines, and let that kind of feed back into the process. And I'm really curious about what kind of physical environment will begin to emerge when architects actually gain control of the tools, when they just say fuck it to these little mice that are on their desk, and they begin to act more like some of these experimental musicians who are literally building their own instruments, building their own kind of algorithms, and it's actually producing some fantastic, I would say, work in other worlds, music and art and other things. So when I think architects have, and it's actually not that hard to do. My workshop right now, they're actually working with some pretty sophisticated stuff in less than 24 hours, right? So I guess in my mind, I think what Greg's work, kind of opened up that, he's, kind of a groundbreaking, he's also super promiscuous and moving, and trying different things out, but I think it's opening up, a broader idea that, we don't just have to rely on all these machines and all these sort of descriptive devices that are handed to us. We actually can begin to customize those in really robust, sophisticated manners. And I think we're just at the beginning of doing that. So the work is sort of awkward, and it is kind of spindly, and it doesn't really quite, I would say the work that was in the panels yesterday, there were some fantastic, but there was also some grotesque parts, and I would say that within the field of sort of the active model field, we're still in that age where we're trying to just figure this stuff out, but I think there's stuff emerging that actually I think is producing some really good things. So I'm actually really intrigued with the kind of the future of these things.
So maybe we'll wrap up since I think we're a little over. I'd like to end with a short narrative actually, and it was 6 months ago when I was sitting with Jimenez and we were eating country ham and drinking coffee, and I think we had pears for dessert, and your cat vomited on my laptop bag. and he knew that this was going to happen, and he kind of looked at me with like a little bit of like skepticism. He's like, "Why do you like robots?" And so I think this has been a nice opportunity to start to answer that question. And I guess I think we all, that's the reason for this conference, like why drawings, why models, why robots? And I think it's been a pretty enlightening couple of days, and it's nice that, things are evolving and every area is taking on a life of its own. And so yeah, thanks for asking that question. I think we should all ask those questions of ourselves because it will only lead to more specificity. So thanks for you guys for participating in this, and thanks for you guys for listening.